Hi, and welcome to Supernatural by Design. I hope everyone's had a blessed week. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're returning, then welcome back. Today's topic will be a two-part series in covering how the number 11 represents God's promises and judgment. So let's begin. You see, God reveals His promises through the number 11. You see, in general, numbers play a big role in the Bible. In fact, one may argue that understanding biblical numerology will give anyone better insight into understanding the book of Revelation, for example, or other Bible prophecies. However, it is the number 11 that we want to stay focused on because of its unique relationship to God's promises and their connection to biblical prophecies. In fact, two in particular, Jesus' first coming and His second coming, because both start out as promises by God. By the end of this video, we will have outlined how the number 11 is found in some unique and key events in the Bible pertaining to the fulfillment of His first promise, which is Christ's first coming. And that armed with this information, we will learn why the number 11 has been more frequent in recent events, celestial signs, the entertainment industry, and even the 11:11 phenomenon. Because we will discover that these same repeating patterns of 11 leading up to His first coming will be the exact same leading up to the fulfillment of His second coming, because both are based on a promise, and therefore painting a clearer picture that we are in fact living in the end times. However, in order to see this fascinating connection, we need a quick foundation on the number 11. So let's begin. Numbers in general, and the number 11 in particular, can be broken into two categories, physical and spiritual. The physical use of numbers is for applying numbers to areas in mathematics, for generating scientific models of our physical universe, whereas the spiritual use of numbers is for applying numbers to biblical prophecy, biblical numerology, and even spiritual warfare. In this particular video, we are centering on the spiritual aspect of the number 11 and analyzing the dual characteristics about the number 11, which is God's promises versus God's judgment. However, we will cover God's promises in this video and then cover God's judgment in a subsequent video, because in both instances, we will find unique events surrounding the fulfillment of either God's promises or judgment, and being uniquely tied to the number 11. And so, with that as our foundation, let's examine the number 11 as it means God's promises. Because in a moment, we will discover that the Word of God is so finely tuned that every number in the Bible, whether a verse or chapter, was deliberately placed there by design. And because we will discover that each chapter and each verse number will match biblical prophecy down to the very day, that you may be surprised to know that there are current examples unfolding right now in modern times. However, I say that to say this, that not only are Bible verses and chapters related to Bible prophecy, but that they are also related to spiritual meanings of numbers. And to demonstrate this, we will make the connection between God's promises and the number 11 by showing some unique examples of where the word promise is tied to a unique verse or chapter that adds to 11. So let's list some examples out, either by the verse, which we'll highlight in yellow, or the chapter plus the verse, which we'll highlight in blue. And so with that said, let's start with Genesis chapter 9 and verse 11. A blue example in that the verse plus the chapter equal 11. And here the word promise is identified with the promise that God would never flood the earth again. Or how about in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 11? A verse example that we have highlighted yellow, just being 11, and tied to a unique moment when Abraham is given instruction about circumcision, the mark of the promise. Or check out this example in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 24. Before Joseph dies, he reiterates to his brothers about the promised land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And again, in Exodus 3:17, when God says, I promise to Moses, when Moses is being called from the burning bush, to be used in the fulfillment of God's promise to the descendants of Abraham and of a promised land. Or how about in Exodus 13 verse 11? The start of the Passover festival, as being a remembrance as the promise made by God to Abraham. And a few examples from the New Testament, we have Galatians 3:29, And here the 29 equals 11 because 2 plus 9 equals 11. But that this example is when Paul is writing Gentile believers about sharing in the promise along with the descendants of Abraham. And our final example in Hebrews 11:9, because by faith we as Gentiles share in the promise made to Abraham. And so as you can see, the word promise is not only tied to the number 11, but more importantly, that there is an underlying theme that is reoccurring, in that it's a promise made to Abraham with regards to Abraham's descendants and the promised land, and demonstrating that the number 11 means promise. And so if promise is tied to the number 11, then what can be said about God's first promise ever recorded in the Bible, which is the promised seed, the promised Messiah, in Genesis chapter 3? Because we will discover that the events leading up to his birth and sacrifice are connected to the number 11, just as we saw with our connection between God and the promise made to Abraham. However, for the case of Jesus, we will discover that the number 11 uniquely predicts to the very day that Jesus would walk into Jerusalem to make the ultimate sacrifice for our sins, and ultimately completing the first phase of God's first promise. Well, to make this connection, we need to investigate Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden, where God made his first recorded promise. So let's investigate further. So if we begin in Genesis chapter 3 and verses 14 and 15, during the story of Adam and Eve, and following right after the forbidden fruit was eaten, we find God making his first promise and first reference of the Messiah, when God states, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." And what is important to note is that this promise is split into two phases, with the first being that there would be a seed of the woman, which is an allusion to the virgin birth of the Messiah, a characteristic of Christ's first coming, and found in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. What is interesting about this particular passage is that the 7 and 14 can be calculated as 111, which is interesting in that I personally believe this connection is a hidden reference to the first phase of the first promise, and therefore 1111 would mean the second phase of the first promise, which is to say the crushing of the head of the seed of the serpent. However, if we dig deeper into the first phase of God's promise and the events leading up to the fulfillment of it, we will discover that many necessary events are not only tied to 11, but are instrumental in the fulfillment of that promise. With that said, let's explore a chronological timeline of the events leading up to the fulfillment of the first promise and its connection to the number 11. So for our first example, we start in the story of Noah's flood, an event that starts in verse 11. In fact, the day the flood happens is on the 47th day of the year and lasts 371 days from start to finish, to which 3 out of the 5 dates listed within that time frame are dates that add to 11. And this example highlights God's preserving of the line of the seed of the woman, to which the Messiah would be born from. In fact, in our second example, we learn that the promised Messiah would come through the line of Abraham, because in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 2 and Genesis chapter 17 and verse 2, we find Abraham's first and fifth promises out of 7. However, God's first promise to Abraham in chapter 12 begins in verse 2. And in our second example from chapter 17, the word promise appears in verse 2. And here in both examples, the 2 is the 11, because 2 only can be summed by 2 ones, or the 11. What is also interesting within the fifth promise to Abram is that this is where Abram has his name changed to Abraham in verse 5. He is also 99 years old when this happens, which is 9 times 11. And lastly, circumcision is introduced in order to mark the promise made between God and Abraham and to his descendants. And interestingly enough, it's verse 11, just like what we saw earlier in the video. Now, if we move on to our third example, Isaac, and place him here, because when Isaac and his wife Rachel have twins, they name them Jacob and Esau, which is interesting because Jacob's name means heel, which if you remember from earlier, back in the Garden of Eden, God stated that the Messiah's heel would be bruised. However, if we examine the fact that Isaac and Rachel had twins, we will find out our next clue, because Teom is the Hebrew word for twins, and this variant only occurs 4 times in the Bible, and listed here. What is interesting to point out is that not only is Genesis 38:27 an example of the verse plus the chapter, like we saw earlier, but that is a reference to Tamar having twins, Perez and Zerah. And Perez would be part of Jesus' genealogy as well. And in both instances, Rachel and Tamar, we have referenced two separate sets of twins. And from these two sets, you have two children, one child from each, and that these two, Jacob and Perez, will be separated by 2 generations as well, highlighting again another unique connection to the number 11 through the number 2. However, what is interesting about the other 2 occurrences of twins found in Song of Solomon's is that Song of Solomon is the 22nd book of the Bible, or 2 times 11. Now let's move on to our 4th example, which is Jacob from a moment ago, because we find the connection to 11 when he becomes an adult, and he is influential in the birth of the nation of Israel, in which the Messiah would eventually come through. And so we find Jacob in Genesis chapter 32, because while scared for his life, he believes Esau, his twin, is getting ready to come and kill him and his family. So he sends out his family into safety and awaits for Esau to come to him in order to buy his family time to escape. Well, we are told that the family consists of 2 wives, 2 slaves, and his 11 children. And so, the 11 here is another example of the preservation of the descendants that would eventually fulfill the genealogy of Jesus. It is also in this moment that the famous scene where Jacob wrestles with God and changes his name to Israel. So let's add Jacob here to the timeline of important people that are God's tools in preserving the promise of the seed of the woman. Our 5th example is actually Jacob's 11th son, Joseph. Because if you're familiar with the amazing story of Joseph, then you would know that he is an illustration of the suffering servant and a foreshadow of Christ. In that, Joseph would be rejected by his own, just as Jesus was rejected by his own. However, Joseph, later in the story, becomes second in command of all of Egypt. And during a severe famine, he was able to rescue his 11 brothers, and in particular, Judah, because Judah would be the genealogy in which Jesus would be born from. However, this example again demonstrates that the number 11 is tied to God's promise, because Joseph is the 11th son and is instrumental in the preservation of the genealogy of the seed of the woman all the way through Abraham and his descendants. And subsequently, after his fathers and brothers and their families relocate to Egypt, Joseph would die at 110 years old, and 1 plus 10 equals 11. However, it would be 400 years later before anything else major would happen in the forming of the nation of Israel, which leads me into our final example, Moses. Because if we fast forward to the 10th plague that hit Egypt, it is here that we get the first Passover celebration in Israel's history, because a death angel would pass over the homes that had a red cross on the door in lamb's blood. And where did the lamb come from? Well, Moses was told by God to get a virgin lamb on the 10th day of the first month, and 10 plus 1 equals 11. And it's this idea of adding the day plus the month that we see the connection between 11. Interestingly enough, the lamb is a foreshadow of Christ. From his entry into Jerusalem, represented as the lamb, his death 4 days later as that of the lambs, and the resurrection of Christ, which is represented as a celebration 3 days later, demonstrating that the lamb in the first Passover is a prophecy down to the very day that Jesus would enter into Jerusalem over 1,000 years later. And it's connected to the number 11. Lastly, what is interesting about the Exodus immediately following the crossing of the Red Sea is that the trip entering the Promised Land was only supposed to take 11 days to get there. However, after complaints and worshiping of false gods became punishable by God, and therefore their journey would end up taking them 38 years, which is an example of God's judgment seen through the number 11, because 3 plus 8 equals 11. And so as you can see in the timeline, from the first promise in Genesis all the way to Jesus entering into Jerusalem, that there are many examples connecting the number 11 to God's first promise, which is that of the seed of the woman. And so, will it be the same for his second coming? Well, to answer that, let's travel into more modern times and see if there are any unique events that are tied to 11 and prophesied in the Bible. Well, before we get into more modern times, let's recap 2 things. First, we know that from Genesis chapter 3 that God promised the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, which is a promise and prophecy of Jesus' second coming and what he would do. Secondly, that the preservation of the promised seed was separated by key events through the nation of Israel and marked by the number 11. Therefore, because of these two things, promise and Israel, that we can conclude that the second coming of Christ will be through the nation of Israel, as well as marked by key events dealing with the number 11. Well, how do we know that Jesus' second coming will come through Israel? Well, according to Matthew 24:15 and Daniel 12:11, which is really interesting because both are examples of 11, we find out that the abomination of desolation, aka the Antichrist, will stand in the Holy of Holies. So first and foremost, we know that the Jews have to be living in Israel before there is a temple built for the Antichrist to even stand in. And because Christ was the ultimate sacrifice made 2,000 years ago, the temple was destroyed, and the Jews had not been able to sacrifice for almost 2,000 years, ultimately scattering the Jews to other nations after the Roman siege in 70 AD, and they remained there for over 1,900 years. So we know that the regathering of Jews marks the beginning of end-time prophecy, because we find out that in Ezekiel chapter 11 and Isaiah 11:11, notice the 11s again, that according to Isaiah 11:11, God regathers the Jews from all the nations. And by doing so, this will set up the construction of the third temple in which the Antichrist will stand in. So all we need to do now is to look at the dates of Israel becoming a nation. Well, there are two unique events marked by 11 in recent history. One after World War II, when the Jews were first regathered into Israel, and the other is the Six-Day War of 1967, when the Jews would recapture the city of Jerusalem since the time of Jesus. The first date corresponding to World War II is November 29th of 1947, which was the date the UN voted and passed UN Resolution 181, which is called United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine. This resolution was even passed on a Sabbath day, interestingly enough, and marked the start of a series of events that would lead to Israel's admission into the UN on 5/11 of 1949. Also, I think it's interesting that November 29th could be written as 11/11, and Isaiah's prophecy of regathering Israel is 11/11 as well. Now for the second date, it is given as 6/5 of 1967, and Ezekiel's prophecy is given to him on 6/5 in chapter 8, and it corresponds to the Six-Day War of 1967, which is the war where Israel recaptured the city of Jerusalem, because prior to 1967, Israel had not occupied the city of Jerusalem, and the Six-Day War ended on the date of 6/11, which is the same as Ezekiel's prophecy, in that Ezekiel's vision ends in chapter 11 as well, with Israel regathered. And both events highlight the number 11, and both are encircled by 4 total lunar eclipses in a row, what is known as a tetrad. However, I simply wanted to mention their connections to lunar eclipses in general because we will go into some detail about those events in a separate video, because ultimately the purpose of this video was to demonstrate that the number 11 represents promise, and therefore because God's first promise was that of Christ's first coming and being through the nation of Israel, that because God's second promise is Christ's second coming, that this event will also be tied to the number 11 and through the nation of Israel. So therefore, because these two dates, 11/29 of 1947 and 6/5 of 1967, match the 11 phenomenon that we found within Christ's first coming, we therefore know that Christ's second coming is imminent. Well, I hope this information was useful. Please note that this is my personal opinion, and I encourage you to do your own research and study the Bible, and see what conclusion you come to. With that said, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Also, check us out on Facebook at SBDTV11, where we drop daily verses, quotes, our videos, and even other apologetics videos. I just want to thank you for watching, have a blessed week, and we'll catch you on our next video.